So the ends of marriage, therefore, have been traditionally expressed in the church as the so-called tria bona matrimoni, the three goods of marriage. Good defined as the finality, what perfects a thing. In juridic parlance, we can speak of the pretension, that which is primarily sought by the juridic act of marriage or of getting married. And these are the good of fidelity, the bonum fide, reducible to the good of the spouses or the bonum conjugi. And then you have the good of offspring, the bonum prole, which is the sanctity of human life, the possibility of reproduction or procreation. And then you have the good of the family, the bonum familia, which is the cradle of humanity. All of those are the natural ends of marriage. But there's a fourth one for those who are baptized. Of course, this doesn't belong anymore to the natural institution of marriage. That won't find any reflection in civil law, because civil law is not that. But in canon law, yes, there's a fourth, which is the good of the sacrament, the bonum sacramenti. Because for the baptized, that natural institution of marriage with the finality that we have studied or seen so far, with the essential qualities that we have seen so far, has been raised by Jesus Christ to become a sacrament. And remember, the definition of a sacrament is the visible sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So in other words, that natural reality of a man and a woman falling in love and setting up a life, a consortium of love and life for the finality of mutual perfection, mutual help, mutual companionship, and for the possible procreation and upbringing of children. Now that was raised by Christ so that it becomes now a sacrament, an avenue for God to give his grace. Pardon me, but when I said the essential qualities, I took it for granted we took it, but I just now, in hindsight, realized that we didn't take it. What are the essential qualities of conjugal love? The essential qualities are those qualities which are inseparable from the consecution of the natural ends that define that union. What are the natural ends again? Mutual help, procreation and upbringing of children, and the good of the family. Now, what are the qualities essential for the attainment of those ends? And you have two. Number one, monogamy. And number two, indissolubility. And let's very briefly tackle that, because that has to be laid to rest as an institution, as a immovable consideration. Love, which is total, which is what conjugal love is the total self-giving of a man in the totality of his personhood as man to a woman in the totality of her femininity as woman, and accepted. Make that mutual, that's what we call conjugal love. Now, if it's like that, look at this. One cannot give himself and then take it back. Whatever is given is not yours anymore. That's what differentiates giving, donation, from lending. Conjugal love is not conjugal lending. Against conjugal lending, you know? Orasan. Just for a while. You know, in 2 Congresses ago, somebody was crazy enough to file a bill which precisely would make marriage, what do you call that, time dependent. So there's putting an expiry date to the marriage contract, no? A 15-year marriage, a 20-year marriage, a 10-year marriage, like getting a license or a visa. That's crazy. Nat King Cole was right. Yeah, remember what Nat King Cole said? If I give my heart, it will be completely. If I fall in love, it will be forever. Those are the two things. To give oneself completely means that there's nothing left over to give to somebody else. That's why it's monogamous. To fall in love forever, I mean, totally means also that it has no end. It will be forever. Otherwise, it's not love. Now, here I put a little bit of an aside so that you can breathe and relax a bit intellectually. Look at this. We're living in a world where people are naturally trained for what I call serial monogamy. That many times young people or people in general confuse love with being monogamous. As long as one is monogamous, that's love. You really frown at somebody who's too timing. Even boyfriend, girlfriends, or people with an MU relationship, they know that where they're in an MU or they're going steady, they're not supposed to be dating somebody else. Otherwise, they're too timing. That's monogamy. But it's not forever. That's why, you go through college. How many girlfriends do you go through college or from high school? I know about you, but I went to several girlfriends in college before I finally got into the priesthood. Because it's like that. Because that kind of a relationship is not for keeps. That's not love. That's a special kind of friendship. That's even not love in the sense that many times it's self-serving. Why do I want a girlfriend? Because I don't want to face the hassle of having to find a date every weekend. At least a girlfriend is always available for the weekend date or something like that. That's what happens in college. That's what happens with yuppies. It's not forever. For as long as it's not for keeps, it's not love yet. Can be a very strong attachment, could be a very, shall we say, a good arrangement, but it's not love. It's not conjugal love. Now, that practice of falling in love, quote unquote, one after another, is what I call serial monogamy. And it's really a wind up to the divorces mentality. Because a person who's used, who was brought up in an environment like that, where he or she said, I love you, but then broke up afterwards, gets used to the idea that you can stop loving. No, you can't stop loving. Love is unconditional. Every parent knows this. You love your children regardless of what happens to them. That's the success of the song of Freddie Aguilar, no? Anak, bakit ka nagkaganyan? But the pathos, why was that song so famous in Japan? Because really, it was a big hit in Japan during that time. And looking at you, most of you will be aware of what I'm talking about. I'm 71 years old. So during that time, I was very conscious already of what was happening. It was a big hit in Japan because it hit at the very core of the Japanese value of filiation, of paternity, the relationship between father and son, and how painful it is for a father if a son misbehaved. Well, love is like that. Love is unconditional. Okay. The essential properties of marriage are monogamy. Conjugal love is exhausted in one beloved. That's why polygamy is wrong. And indissoluble, true love has no expiry date. And of course, it's open to life. That's why sexual intercourse to which conjugal love is naturally oriented is of itself fertile. That's why contraception is wrong. Now, this is the natural structure of marriage. It's not subject to human restructuring the same way that human nature is not subject to reengineering. You know, Nowadays, they're so crazy. This became an issue in this Olympics, the Paris Olympics, right? Remember that boxer, um, or those two boxers? The poor Italian gave up 40 seconds in the first round because, according to her, she had never been hit by any woman that hard. No? By the way, that's not the gender issue because really, that poor opponent was really a woman. Genetically, she was, I mean, chromosomally, she was a woman, XX. But as I said, even if the chromosomes are like that, the genetic material admit of a certain margin variation, so that this particular woman had so much testosterone that she had very, very masculine characteristics. But she was still a woman. She always considered herself a woman. She had always moved around and competed in feminine sports. But it's up to the athletic authorities to control the parameters acceptable for fair play. Imagine if one day the Chinese, because they have 1.5 billion of them, were able to put together a team of basketball who are all 8-footers. An 8-footer basketball team. They're male men's basketball. It's basketball, and they don't have any extra things. But you think they will be admitted in the Olympics? Maybe the first time, yes, but immediately afterwards, the Olympic Committee will make rules putting a limit, a height limit to basketball, because it's not fair to have people competing that way. They're abnormal already. Okay, these are the things. I'm sorry. What is this? There's an advertisement here asking me to renew my subscription. No. Now let's go to this. As I said, what we have discussed so far is the natural structure of marriage. It's not subject to human restructuring. What canon law and civil law have done is to express this reality in juridic terms so that it can be protected and enforced. Now, this is what is meant by the juridic structure of this reality, this natural institution, which is marriage. How that natural institution is reflected in enforceable norms, enforceable provisions, exigible, then that makes it rather juridic. You can form a union whatever way you want. But if you want it to be marriage, then it must follow the norms of what marriage is. And here's the problem. While in canon law, marriage is such an important matter because it's precisely because it's the quote unquote natural vocation of the vast majority of human beings. If you're a believer, if you read the sacred scripture, you will see that from the very beginning, chapter 1 of Genesis, that man or God created man and as woman. And it says this, for this reason, a man shall leave mother and father and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. In other words, the purpose of the differentiation of the sexes into male and female, the normal thing that should happen is that they get married. They fall in love with each other and they set up a family. Now, if that's the case, then you can imagine that in canon law, in the juridic structure of the church, an awful lot of thought, an awful lot of provisions will be dedicated to that reality because it's so crucial. In contrast, very little will be dedicated to litigation of properties and objects and monetary considerations because that's not important, very important to the church. Well, in civil law, on the other hand, this reality of marriage, even if you look at the family code, look at the family code. It's supposed to regulate marriage and family. Look at what the articles or the laws, the norms that are there. Most of it will have to do with property, litigation, etc., etc. Very little with marriage itself. It's a mindset. And because it's like that, it's understandable, therefore, that the way civil law or the family code will regulate marriage and how to prove that there's a real marriage will also be. And that's the core of the problem of divorce. That the reality of broken marriages, of dysfunctional marriages, rather, or let's call it this, dysfunctional unions, why they cannot be declared invalid is because the family code does not have the sufficient articles or articulation grounds that canon law, on the other hand, has. And saddled with this limitation, then it finds itself helpless in the face of the reality of dysfunctional or irreparably broken marriages. And faced with that helplessness, what are we going to do with this? The facile solution is just to say divorce, forgetting the fact that, look at this is important. They object that rather than improve the articles for the declaration of nullity, let's just make divorce, it's easier. Not really. Think about it. If it's going to go through a rigorous process, as it should, if you're going to declare divorce, for the same effort, for the same paperwork, for the same instruction, because that's what it's called in judicial terms, effort at instruction or time, hours in instruction of the case. You can also try it for nullity. As a matter of fact, it will be easier. Why? Because if you really follow the real grounds for divorce, then it will not be very easy to do it. The problem is there's a sleight of hand here with the effort to get divorce legislation. They keep on saying it's there, no? It's not going to be a no-fault divorce, but it's going to be a divorce which you will have to prove the fault. Unlike what's happening in the Western world nowadays, it's what you call no-fault divorce. You get a divorce just because one person doesn't want anymore, and if you don't want anymore, that's it. You get a divorce. No, the people of Congress say, I mean, the pro-divorces, they will say that's not the kind of divorce we're going to institute. It will be a fault divorce. Well, that's what they say. That's what all the divorce laws started with. But it segues through the passage of years very quickly, as a matter of fact, into no fault divorce. There's no country in the world with a fault divorce. Where you have divorce, it's a no fault divorce. It's logical. When you've broken the barrier that marriages cannot be broken, then it's just a matter of how easy or how difficult is it to break it. But it can be broken. And that's the principle that must be defended, that real marriage cannot be broken. And the reason why we have declarations of nullity in the Catholic Church is because we have the provisions to show that marriage never came about. It's not an annulment, much less is it a divorce. It's a declaration of nullity. And this is what we're going to get into now after I give you a 5-minute rest. You stretch your legs and exercise. If we were a Japanese company, we'll all rise up and bend and stretch, reach for the stars and things like that. You see, I'm a good teacher.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you very much.
Now let's go to what I had mentioned earlier as the juridic structure of marriage. It's the articulation of the institutional content of marriage in law. Because as I said earlier, unless something can be demanded, claimed as a right, with due protection in court. That's what you call in legal parlance, for those of you who are lawyers out there, as the right of action. Unless something is actionable, then it's just your claim. No? You can claim whatever you want until you're blue, but if it's not actionable, you cannot demand redress from a court or from the system. But if it's actionable, then it can be enforced. Now, this is what we mean by the juridic structure of marriage. So the things that can make the ingredients for a real marriage enforceable. That's what this means. So that later on, if it doesn't work or something goes wrong, you can claim that, kasi naman, hindi kami nakasal because of this or because of that. This is a two-edged sword. Why? Because if on the other hand, all the ingredients are really there, if it doesn't work, it's not because there was no marriage. It's because somebody changed his mind, is reneging on his commitments to love and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, till death. And no law should enable somebody to do that. Again, no, before I move any further, we're living in a world where we try to legalize what we want to do. Baliktad yung process eh. That's, my students in law, I always tell them, don't be just lawyers, be jurists. There's nothing I hate more than the concept of lawyering, or making use of the law as a profession. Hanap buhay lang yan. No. You have to be a jurist. You have to know what law means, what right and wrong is, what the juridic structure is, what's enforceable, what is not, and the logic behind it. If not, I illustrate this, David. You get a typical Taipan. Well, typical, maybe. Yeah, okay. Imagine a Taipan. One of these rich guys who didn't go through college, but who is very good at making money. And who he wants to do something. What will he do? He'll think of something, an idea. I want to do this. Then he calls his lawyers. Okay, how can I do this? Give me the provisions that will make this legal. That's what I call lawyering. No? You're prostituting the science of law, a juridic science, which is a very high calling and a very beautiful science. You're prostituting it at the service of what somebody wants to do. Dapat baliktad. You have to look at the law first and see what are the viable legal options for whatever finality, whatever pretension you might have. Ganun dapat. Hirap nga hindi ganun eh, because we have original sin. So that's what we're up against. Now we have to help people understand this. Now let's go to the juridic structure of marriage. The juridic structure of marriage rests on three pillars. What makes it juridic, enforceable, demandable, actionable? One is capacity, the second one is consent, and the third one is form. What is capacity? Capacity is the juridically, legally defined characteristics that can enable a person to get married. Minimum requirements for getting married, therefore. Now here's the thing. Since, as we read in Genesis chapter 1, God made man and woman so that they can get married to each other. Intuitively, you see that men and women are naturally capable of getting married. The incapacity to get married would be an exception. So rather than define all the requirements for getting married, what canon law did was just to define what are these characteristics that renders a person incapable. That without this, you're capable. So true is this that in canon law, it's even called a right. The jus connubii, the right to get married, is a native human right. It's the right of anyone to get married. Of course, when you say right, when people say right, there's a normal thing that you hear, that to every right, for every right, there is a corresponding obligation, right? But what most people don't realize is that right and that obligation belong to two people. No? Most of the times when you say right, then I have an obligation. No. If I have a right, then somebody else has an obligation to respect this right. I have a right to this, somebody has to give me that. No? So when you say somebody has the native right to get married, oops, please mute yourselves. Yun. Ro-
Father, you got muted.
Somebody muted me. Okay, how long have I been muted? I
Just a
I
short while.
think after you called out, the person was not muted.
okay. That's fine. So capacity then. That the problem is when we say that um, in the generality of cases, men or human beings have the right to get married. The problem is who has the obligation to get married to them, right? So now that right to get married, the corresponding responsibility to respect that right is not a person to get married to them, but rather the system. No, you have a right to get married, and society in general, the state in general, the government has the obligation to allow you to get married. That's the thing there. It's just like the right of, I don't know, shelter, the right of shelter, the right of nourishment, the right of clothing, the right of education. All of those are fundamental human rights, right? But then who has the obligation to satisfy that right? And then you see, oh, ano, who is obliged to give me food? Who is obliged to give me shelter? Who is obliged to give me education? And you realize not a single person is obliged to do that. The state is. That's the reason why the goal of any functioning political community, any functioning state or society is to be able to satisfy the fundamental human rights of its constituents. Because that cannot be, shall we say, satisfied by the individual person. No, nobody is obliged to give me education or to give me clothes, etc. No? That's the reason why the canto boy there who gets into your backyard and steals your mangoes, claiming that he has a right to food because he's hungry, because you have a right to private property also. He can go to the Department of Welfare to demand that food and to demand that mango, but not to you as an individual or as a private citizen. So that's how this thing works. No? So therefore, going to this capacity. So canon law has defined a set of 12 characteristics that renders a person incapable of getting married. Age, there's a minimum age. Minimum age is 18. Actually, in the universal law of the church, it's 16 for girls and 14 for boys, but with the provision that the individual Episcopal Conference can raise it, and the CBCP raised it to 18 for us, for both boys and girls. You know, if it were up to me, I would make it 18 for girls and 24 for boys. Because in this country, boys take so long to mature to manhood. No, I mean, your typical 21-year-old. I mean, think about you. Will you allow your daughter to get married to a 21-year-old guy? Is most 21-year-olds are irresponsible. At 24, they're still playing. No, only exceptionally are they good enough to marry your daughter. You know? But your daughter, yeah, at 18, she can get married. Women are very responsible in this country, but men are not. Pardon me. No, I mean, that's an endemic problem in Philippine society, which is another matter that I can talk about for at least half an hour, why it's like that. But I'm not going to do that. So age, and then a previous marriage, the bond of marriage. So an existing marriage renders a person incapable of getting married because he is already married. Consanguinity, a certain degree of consanguinity, etc., etc. So those are the so-called impediments, which I'm not going to go into one by one. And then you have consent. Consent is really what brings about marriage. The I do, not the will to get married to each other. Now, as you can imagine, that's a very internal act, right? The consent, that's internal. Although for marriage to take place validly, it must be expressed externally. But it's very easy to say, I do. As people, they even in church, they get married, they make those vows, right? They a series of I do's in church. But here is where the cookie crumbles. Because whereas the impediments or the absence thereof are easy to prove, they can be proven with documents, whether you've been married or a certain age, etc., or whether or not you're related by blood, or all of those impediments are easily demonstrated. That's why they're subject to documentary proof. Consent is not so. And here is where canon law has centuries of jurisprudence ahead of civil law, the family code. Because, of course, the family code is saddled with the fact that only those things which can be seen outside easily, proven in court, can be valid or can have any juridic relevance. Well, in canon law, it has been sufficiently articulated such that the components of consent, what goes into genuine consent, are articulated into norms that can be tested in court. That's the reason why in the processes of the declaration of nullity, I'm a judge. So therefore that's my, I'm not going to say that's my day job. My day job is to be a priest and hear confessions and things like that. But my, it's not a day job. What is it? No, my weekend work is in the matrimonial tribunal. And so I do a lot of these things too. And what do you call this? The most common ground for the declaration of marriage nullity does not fall under impediments or capacity. It falls under consent, a vitiated or a defective consent. And we shall look into that later. And then the third is form, the juridical form of the celebration of marriage. It's the external manifestations to express the will to marry each other, you know. So the so-called in canon law, it's called the canonical form of marriage, which can be summarized in two, the presence of the two spouses. Third, the presence of a qualified witness, qualified meaning to say a special witness, who stands in the name of the church to witness that marriage is taking place. Because the real protagonists of marriage, as you can very well imagine, are the spouses. Even in Catholic terminology, in sacramental law, sacramental theology, the ministers of marriage is not the sacred ministers. The ministers of marriage are the spouses. They're the ones who marry each other. They're the ones who bring about the sacrament. So how about the sacred minister? He's just a special witness, a qualified witness, who witnesses that marriage is taking place properly with all the requirements, etc. And then plus two more witnesses. So those are the personalities in a marriage, 5 minimum. The two spouses, the what do you call this, the qualified witness, who's either the bishop or the parish priest or any other sacred minister deputized by them, or even in the absence of sacred ministers, they can even delegate this to a layman who will be the special witness. Without, then you will have a marriage without a priest, but with a layman that has been deputized to do that, plus 2 more witnesses. So 5. That's the minimum requirement. And then other requirements for licitude, but not anymore for validity. It must be in the proper place and in the proper venue. Venue, place rather, is the geographic place. No, people must get married in their own parish in principle, although they can get married somewhere else, but with the proper delegation of their parish priest. No, I always point this out in my classes at matrimonial law. Be careful with those people getting married in all kinds of esoteric places like Tagaytay or Boracay or whatever. Because unless there's proper delegation, then those will be invalid. They may not even be registered. And if they're not registered, then they don't exist in canon law. Then two people were not married after all, if they were not registered properly. So be careful with these things, no? So this is the so-called canonical form. And again, there's no problem with this part. This is straightforward. This is documentary. That's easy to prove, whether it was registered, whether there were witnesses, whether there's records of it. That's easy to prove. The real, shall we say, battleground is consent. And that's where we go. Mhm. What are the causes of juridic marriage nullity? When do we declare a marriage a non-marriage in church, so that it's invalid, what you call ab initio, from the beginning? There was no marriage. There's no marriage to annul. There's no marriage to divorce. There's no marriage to dissolve. There was no marriage to begin with. So the declaration of marriage nullity, the ecclesiastical authority, always through a judicial process, always, never administrative, declares that a given marriage, hitherto presumed valid, was in fact invalid from the start, due to a defect in any of the three factors that juridically structure marriage: either the presence of an incapacity to contract due to an impediment or incapacity to assume; second, a defective consent; or a lack of canonical form. As I said, the incapacity in terms of the 12 impediments or the lack of canonical form, that's a no-brainer. Now, here's a little note on incapacity. Because remember what incapacities are, no? They are legally defined situations that render a person incapable. So it's something rendered by law. For example, we say that legally the law says you have to be 18. Otherwise, you're incapable of getting married. Now, if you're 17 and a half and precocious, in fact, you really are capable of getting married, especially if you're a woman, a girl. As I said, the universal law puts girls at 14. You know, the minimum age in the universal canon law for girls is 14, which means to say, therefore, a 17-year-old girl is perfectly capable of getting married normally. But just to be sure, the law says, no, no, no. It has to be 18. And below 18, ipso facto, you will be incapable of getting married. So it's defined by law. Now, one of these provisions of law that renders an incapacity is the famous Canon 1095, 1095, with 3 paragraphs, 1, 2, and 3. I'm sorry, I forgot to paste it here, but I'll just say it, no? It says, the following persons are incapable of getting married, rendered incapable by law. Number 1, those who lack the use of reason. Well, of course, you have the use of reason, right? Either permanently, because you're insane, or you're immature, or under the influence of drugs, alcohol, right? Those who lack the use of reason. 2, those who suffer from a severe or serious lack of discretion of judgment in order to accept, mutually accept the essential obligations and rights of marriage. So if a person lacks due discretion or discretion of judgment, lack of clear thinking, in general, not necessarily in that moment when he says, I do, or when he forms the consent. If there's lack of due discretion, lack of serene judgment in order to give and to accept the rights and obligations of marriage, is incapable. You know, this is very tricky. It's normally called in civil parlance LDD, lack of due discretion. But the canonical expression for it is a serious lack of discretion of judgment, or grave lack of discretion of judgment. What do you mean by that? I only illustrate it normally by this simple thing. The minute you can say regarding a marriage, uh, in a case, what were you thinking? When you can say, what were you thinking? What were you thinking getting to a jerk like that? What were you thinking getting married to a girl like that? What were you thinking getting married under those circumstances? The minute you can say that, it means in your mind, intuitively, you're already judging that hindi masyadong inisip to, no? That's what grave lack of due discretion is. The thing is, it's easy to say that, but in canon law, in jurisprudence, in many sentences of the Roman Rota, that had been explained and articulated in its elements. What are the ingredients that you can see, that you can detect, you can prove in court that points to lack of due discretion? Di ba ang ganda? Kasi madaling sabihin, hindi nag-isip, but how can you prove that in court? Well, in canon law, nahimayin na yun. No? Such things as psychological baggage, that's it, not necessarily psychological incapacity, psychological nervyoso, no? Yung tao na yan, madaling mataranta. You see? Medyo nabuntis. Medyo, pwede ba namang medyo buntis? I remember many years ago, in confession, somebody was telling me, a young lady, no, that she was medyo pregnant now. So I really laughed. What do you mean medyo pregnant? There's no such thing as medyo pregnant. Either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant, but not medyo pregnant. Anyway, so that what she meant was she suspects that she's pregnant, no? That can happen. And just because she suspects she's pregnant, she was not thinking properly, sige na nga, no, kahit na ganyan yung ugali niya, sige na, no, or whatever. Or somebody pressured by peer pressure. I had a case before, 33-year-old woman, comes from a very good family, youngest. All the older are successful in multinationals and things like that, CEOs. She's the only one who's not yet married. She type A personality, working in a bank. So biological clock ticking. And one fine summer day in a vacation, meets Prince Charming in Europe, and she gets swept off her feet, and within a month they're married. And it turns out he's narcissistic, he's a real jerk, etc., etc., and so it didn't last. So that's a typical situation of lack of due discretion. Now, the third of those three provisions is the so-called psychological incapacity. Now, what is psychological incapacity? Psychological incapacity. That's the most misunderstood because that's the only thing that was lifted from canon law by the family code of the Philippines, psychological incapacity. Psychological incapacity in canon law is really phrased this way: the incapacity to assume the essential obligations of marriage for reasons of a psychological nature. In civil law, ginawa na lang psychological incapacity. But there's a danger to that terminology. Because what incapacitates a person is not the psychological state. What incapacitates a person is the incapacity to assume the obligations, which is tantamount to saying the incapacity to deliver what he is committing himself to in marriage. No? You cannot commit yourself to something that intrinsically you're incapable of delivering. You see, that's the logic. But since we already said that it's a natural human ability to get married to the point that it's even a right, then to say that someone is incapable of delivering the obligations of marriage is tantamount to saying that the only reason for that must be psychological. Why? Because the only other reason, which is physical, is covered in the impediments: impotence, the incapacity to carry out the sexual act or conjugal union. That's already in the impediments. So if it's not that, It must be a psychological abnormality that makes a person incapable of loving, incapable of delivering the obligations of marriage. So that's the third of those the three factors. And in law, in canon law, they were described as incapacitating qualities or impediments. Hmm? They render a person incapable. So, okay. So those are the shall we say the parameters juridically determinable, detectable, can be proven in court beyond reasonable doubt that renders a person incapable or that renders a consent invalid. And so therefore, since consent is what makes marriage, that marriage invalid. At the expense or the risk of belaboring the point, let me go a little bit further on that. That in the declaration of nullity, what we are proving is that the consent, or rather, that the marriage did not come about. Note, that's very important because when you say you're proving, you're demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt, so proving beyond reasonable doubt, that a marriage did not come about. So the factors, the parameters, or the phenomena to be investigated must be things or factors or conditions or environmental elements that existed at the time of the marriage, of the wedding, of the I do. Things that happen afterwards are almost irrelevant to the case unless they point to the existence of something at the moment of marriage. You know, in canon law or in matrimonial law, this is so beautifully described by the distinction between marriage in facto, the actual condition of being married, and the marriage in fieri, the coming about of marriage. The marriage in facto is what marriage is, what we studied in the first part of the first hour of this afternoon, meaning to say the nature, the finality, the ends, and the essential qualities of marriage. That's the marriage in facto. Now, the marriage in fieri is how that marriage in facto comes about. And it comes about in a meeting of the minds, in the consent, which is a human act, which needs therefore the intervention of the intellect and the will. Nobody can say I do validly without having thought about it, that's the intellect, and then freely willed it, wanted it. The intellect and the will. So therefore, in the study of the validity of the consent, one must descend to how the intellect works and how freedom works, and anything that can vitiate, meaning to say introduce defect, undermine the quality of the intellectual process and the quality of the choice process, the volitive process, the act of the will, may affect the validity of the consent. And that's what happens in a cause for nullity. You show that intellectually something failed, or willfully something failed, violated freedom. Behind the marriage nullity cause or case due to invalid consent is either of two reasons: a lack of true judgment, no? The lack of the proper decision-making process to get married, as I said earlier, no? Hindi pinag-isipan. Look, I say lack, not defective. Thus, the act of the will to marry would have been made contrary to or without the true judgment, but rather moved. Because if it's not the intellect that moved the will to want marriage, then what moved it? Something else. You always you always will for a cause. And it would be either violence or emotions, sentiments, internal. And that's what they call a lost judgment. There was no judgment, in other words. There was no discretion of judgment. Or if it's not that, it's a faulty judgment. That's why it says severe or grave lack of due discretion. to get married. And this in turn can be due to ignorance, not knowing, error, knowing, but knowing wrong. There's a difference between ignorance and error. Ignorance, you know, or you don't know, rather, and you don't know. And error is, you know, but what you know is wrong. And the lack of deliberation. And that's what I call imperfect judgment. Hmm? Now, there's a whole gamut of possibilities in that thinking process. One is lost, a lost judgment, hindi naisip, or confused and unsure, you know. Typical situation, no? Ni susulong, atras, and not sure, pero andun na yun, nakahanda na lahat, andyan na lahat ng mga imbitado, or we distributed already the invitations, ang laki-laki ng down payment sa reception, sa restaurant. So all of those things, and the poor girl or the poor guy, kahit na unclear, so bahala na nga, no? Papa sa Diyos ko na lang. You know, it's like making a building. Imagine if you're going to make a building, 10-floor building, right? And then at the last moment, you realize, mali-mali yata itong plano, mali yung calculations, or hindi po masasaboard yung civil engineer, yung structural engineer. So all kinds of doubts, no? Ay, pero nakahanda na lahat. Andyan na yung loan. Andyan na yung, ano, madidibanda ako pag hindi. Sige na nga, ipapasa Diyos ko na lang. Pwede ba naman yun? No? Then that thing will collapse. And if it collapses, you can later on sue for invalid plans, invalid what? So you don't do that, right? Okay. Matrimonial consent can be vitiated in Genesis by factors affecting either or both the intellect and the will. No? I'd like to kind of belabor this point because it's important. Let me see. What are the factors that can affect the intellect? What the psychologists would say, cognitive anomalies. No? The anomalies, abnormalities in the knowing process. It could be internal, as I said, damaged use of reason or a faulty use of reason due to lack of age, lack of development, or effect of drugs, alcohol and things like that, or simple immaturity or emotions. Those are internal to the intellect, or it could be external, an error caused by fraud. You know, actually, this is more common than you think. Meaning to say, people getting married not knowing very well what they're getting into. Your typical romantic who got married, love at first blush, a hurried or no courtship whatsoever, or a courtship from distance. I just adjudicated the case, or I'm adjudicating it right now. I've written it, but still, people have to sign the. And the whole problem was, yeah, there was courtship, but come to think of it, the guy was a seaman and was always away. And also, if you add up the time that they were together and really dealing with each other, it was something like 6 months. Even if really it took almost 1.5 years, it's still 1.5 years. That's still short, no? From the time they got introduced to each other to the time they were married was more or less 1.5 years. But the actual interaction, F to F, face to face, was 6 months because the other times he was abroad. And then, sure enough, pretty soon the real characteristics of the girl came out, and she's like this, she's that. In the first place, she was so young. She was only 19, and the guy was already 30 plus, no? So, paano nangyari yun, no? So, yun. So, lack of due discretion, lack of error. Now, here's the thing with error. In canon law, there are articles, there are norms that says this. Error regarding a person invalidates marriage. invalidates consent. Meaning to say, you got married to the wrong person. Pwede mo naman yun, you got married to the wrong person. Yeah, pwede, no? Especially nowadays, people magliligawan through text, magliligawan through Viber, magliligawan through a long-distance relationship. Or, a more baroque situation, here's a case of identical twins. You fell in love with one, and then you got married to the other. So the wrong twin, right? So things like those can happen. So it seems bizarre. How can you get married to the wrong person? Well, you can, and it has happened. So, however, error regarding equality of a person will not invalidate consent. Unless, here's the unless, it's about a quality that is directly willed, without which one would not have married. So talagang magpapakasal lang ako if a person is a virgin, for example. And you thought the person was a virgin, then later on you discovered hindi pala a virgin. If you want to sue for nullity, you can. Worse is if the quality, if the error is caused because of fraud, that the person deliberately misrepresented himself or herself regarding a quality which of itself could cause difficulty in conjugal life. You see how articulated this is? You'll never find something like that in the family code. But in canon law, it is there. If somebody withheld a quality, a characteristic that of itself makes married life difficult for the purpose of getting consent, then that's invalidating. If that can be proven in court afterwards, then you can get a declaration of nullity. Now, what are these? For example, masyado ka maraming utang pala, So you're going to enter marriage with hanggang dito utang, or you have anak sa labas na hindi mo sinabi. Or you're a secret agent, you're a spy of the Chinese, or I don't know what, you're a sleeper agent, and things like those. Or even the thing of virginity that I said earlier. If that really matters to the person and ask, are you a virgin? And somebody said yes, and then she's not. Well, that's ground for nullity. So these are the things, Because you look at it, it's common sense. Because will or consent is what goes into marriage. So therefore, if there are things that can affect the quality of that consent, it should, if it can be proven in court, be grounds for the declaration of nullity. Okay? Now, what are the factors affecting the will? There can be internal factors like fear. Yeah. The typical omnia parata sunt, or an arranged marriage, or the typical situation where a girl gets pregnant and is not really ready to get married, or this is just a casual affair, but oops, she gets pregnant, and will put so much shame on the family and will displease her parents. So sige na nga. So she allows she gets married under those circumstances. Well, that invalidates the marriage. Or external violence. So that's the typical shotgun marriage. It doesn't have to be shotgun. And by the way, this fear, the notion of fear, it is externally caused. It doesn't even have to be, shall we say, deliberately caused. Meaning to say someone maybe, because fear, where is fear? Fear is very subjective. It's the person who's contracting who is afraid. Maybe the person causing that fear did not really want to cause it. I have a wonderful slide on this where you have a person in a shotgun marriage, so to speak, because the father has a shotgun, but because to coerce him to saying yes. But he had the shotgun because he was going to go duck hunting, and he was in a hurry because the ducks are flying. So poor guy was pressured to saying yes just because the father-in-law had a shotgun with that was not the intention of the father-in-law, but it produced fear. If it can be proven that it produced fear, and he was afraid, and there's a reason for him to say yes, and that's a ground for nullity. Now, after seeing all of this, what are the things that come to mind? And what comes to mind are the following. That what is needed more than, and here I'm going to share with you another stop share. You are in sharing mode. Share. I will share this instead. I'm sorry. Do you see my slide, my new slide? You see it, right?
Not yet, Father.
No, not yet.
There are three things that need to be introduced to the family code to make it more, shall we say, agile in declarations of nullity. Because as I said, what is needed is not a divorce bill that will affect all marriages, but rather measures to make declaration of nullity more agile and more accessible to everyone faster, so that troublesome marriages can be declared null. And the only things that will fall out of this, they cannot be declared null because they were really valid, will therefore be cases of what? Somebody reneging on his commitments. And no law should be passed to let him get away with that. No, it's just like the legalization of abortion or the legalization of marijuana or drugs or the legalization of prostitution. I mean, those are very bad measures. You shouldn't legalize something which is wrong. At least we can regulate it. Yeah, the way to regulate it is not to let it happen. That's the way to regulate it, not to let it happen in a more, shall we say, reasonable way. Like what happened with abortion in England. There was a time in the 1990s, early 90s, when there was a lot of discussion regarding abortion in England, because it was already, because they had abortion. And the gist of the argument was how to make abortion more painless for the fetus. what what absurdity, no? I mean, you're going to end his life, but at least don't make it painful for him. So that was the thing. That's crazy, no? So that's exactly what happens with the legalization of abortion, the legalization of divorce, the legalization of homosexual unions or marriage. All of these are wrong behaviors, wrong acts, and you're trying to legalize it. Well, you should not legalize anything that's wrong. Rather, offer an alternative solution, and this is the alternative. You know? So the lack of due discretion of judgment is one of the most common grounds for the declaration of marriage nullity in church tribunals. It's based on the invalidity of a marriage consent that stemmed from a defective judgment at the moment of giving consent due to the incidence of immaturity, error, deceit, fear, and even psychological factors in the decision-making process. It's quite obvious why such a defective decision to marry could later on lead to an irreparably broken marriage. That is, such a marriage had no leg to stand on in the first place. So again, don't legalize divorce, which will affect all marriages. Make it possible to detect this defect and to declare that such a marriage is invalid from the start. Then the other thing is
Father?
simulate.
Excuse me, Father. You have me
Yes.
change to your slide?
I haven't changed my slide.
Yeah. That
I
was
thought,
still on the consent.
okay, because I changed the screen that I'm sharing. It seems like that didn't happen. Let me
Stop
see.
share, Father. And then
I have to
reshare.
stop share first.
Yes, po.
And it just
Okay.
change just like that, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
opo.
I was trying to do a shortcut and that didn't work, obviously. So let's change that. Uh-huh. So there. Share. And then share. Share. Get it? Do you have it now?
Yes, Father. Yes, po. It's
Okay.
highlighted in green.
Yes. I'll just increase your size so I can see you. There you are. Yes, I have 3 screens in front of me, you know. Uh, so the lack of due discretion, we saw that. And now let's even have a touch screen here. So simulation. Now, what is simulation? Another very common thing. Simulation occurs. Let me just increase the size of this so that you can read it easier. Yeah. Simulation occurs when a couple goes through the external motions of a wedding ceremony, but without the intention of entering into the institution of marriage. Kung wari nagpapakasal, but in their mind, hindi naman sila nagpapakasal. Now, that can be done 2 ways. Either ayaw nila talaga magpakasal or ayaw nila ng isang essential quality of marriage. So the exclusion of one of the essential qualities of marriage, and what are the essential qualities of marriage again? There are 3, remember? Number 1, indissolubility. Number 2, monogamy. And 3, openness to life. So if any of those 3 is excluded internally, then that marriage is what you call simulated. An example is a marriage of convenience for the purpose of facilitating immigration, but without the intention of living together as husband and wife. Less extreme cases are those of a couple who, at the time of the wedding, had the intentions of excluding an essential property of marriage, such as procreation. The couple does not want to have children at all, or unity, cases of open relationship, and indissolubility. The couple is open to the possibility of divorce. Marriages tainted by simulation are void for the same reason that absolutely simulated contracts are void under Article 1409 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, because the couple did not enter into the marriage contract in the first place. Now, this is not in the civil legislation, but it can very well be included for this reason. If marriage is a contract, then it should follow the requirements for a valid contract. And one of the invalidating factors for a contract is this, Article 1409 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, the Philippine Civil Code. On the other hand, here's a third one. A person who contracts marriage inveigled by deceit, perpetrated in order to secure consent concerning some quality of the other party, which of its very nature can seriously disrupt conjugal life, does so invalidly, means the marriage or consents invalidly. Such is the case, for example, of a person who marries a person who has hidden the fact of his or her homosexuality or criminal status or having dependent children out of wedlock or drug addiction or other such characteristics. There are other incidences of defective consent, which the Code of Canon Law recognizes as grounds for nullity of marriage, and which could similarly be imported into Philippine law. This could cover all the truly meritorious cases of irreparably broken marriages with irreconcilable difference. That is to say, all cases of marriages which were really void ab initio. I say almost, because the only exceptions would be those which are valid, and as I said, for the end time now, therefore, people who want a divorce for that really just want to renege on their commitments, and no law should justify such a heinous act of reneging on your commitments. Finally, a change of terminology would really help clarify the issues. A glaring point is to do away with the difference in the family code between void and voidable marriages, such that marriages tainted by fraud, violence, undue intimidation, etc., would not be merely voidable, as they're called now in the family code, but rather void, ab initio. Because if you think about it, what's the difference between void and voidable? For those of you who are lawyers there, is one of the discussions that I hope you got into. And if not, well, I just wish you were in my class instead in matrimonial law, because I really believe at this point that the difference between void and voidable is absolutely, pardon me again, because I don't mince words with these things, stupid. You know? One consequence of this is that under Article 39 of the same code, the parties to such marriages will still have a remedy available even beyond the 5-year limit currently imposed under Article 47 of that code, and would not be limited to psychological incapacity under Article 36 of that code to have their marriages declared null and void from the start. And here's a little aside. Unfortunately, as I said, when the family code was crafted as a concession, because they really, some people wanted divorce, but okay, that's divisive and it's against the values. And besides, we were under Cory Aquino at that time, so they instead imported something from the Code of Canon Law, and I have it in my conscience that at that time when I was consulted by the nunciature, no less, how that family code was, I said, no, it's okay. It's taken from the Code of Canon Law. At that time, I was very young. I was a very young priest. I didn't have enough experience. That little did I realize that, yeah, it was taken, but taken very defectively. No? They just got Article 3, Canon 1095, paragraph 3, precisely the so-called psychological incapacity. And it just so happens that that particular ground is one of the least used grounds in nullity cases. Because I always say this, no, that normally for the greater part, people are psychologically normal. Because it's a curve, di ba? The so-called normal curve. The bell, it's also called the bell curve for those of you who have taken statistics in college or in high school. It's called a bell curve, or it's called the Gaussian curve, no? The Gauss curve. It's like that. That the great part of the population is there in the normal, and then there are very few incidences in one side or the other of normalcy. Is normalcy, no? So the great there are there, either under normal or sobra normal, no? But then the little symptotic curve there at the ends, very few people are abnormal psychologically. That the preponderant majority are normal. So therefore, psychological abnormalcy as a ground for a dysfunctional marriage will seldom happen. Now, unfortunately, precisely that's the only thing that was imported by the family code. Ano nga mangyayari? So they have to massage everything to that thing, which is not real, by the way. So many of the declarations of nullity in civil courts is moral, psychological incapacity. I once adjudged a case in the ecclesiastical tribunal that had been adjudged in civil court already, and on the ground of psychological incapacity because the husband was homosexual. I remember interviewing the driver, no? May napansin ka bang, kabadingan dun sa boss mo? The guy told me, Father, wala. Actually, yung problema talaga dyan, kung saan beer house ko nga siya hinahatid. Dahil babaero talaga yung boss ko, no? So, the problem was the opposite, no? Then when I interviewed the guy, I asked him, ba't ganun? And then you know what he told me? Well, I wanted out. I got a lawyer, and that's what they said, and he made the case based on that. Ewan ko, paano yung ginawa yun? Very easy. You get a psychological evaluation, you pay the person, and you get it. That's the reason why civil nullity or annulment cases are so expensive. The typical package for annulment in civil court is 300,000 pesos. Papataas. I have a client uh, who has already spent 600,000 pesos, hindi pa rin niya makuha-kuha because he happened to be raffled off to a judge who considered herself a very good Catholic, daily mass goer, and she systematically was making all kinds of problems because she didn't want to grant an annulment in court. So delay and delay, delay and delay. Actually, it was already the lawyer na awa na sa kanya and say, sir, awa na ako sa'yo, 600,000 na, wala pa rin nangyayari. Let's just drop this case. Let some time pass and refile it in another tribunal. And that's what exactly happened. No? So that's the problem. And that's what's in the mind of the pro-divorce camp. They see that reality, ang hirap-hirap kumuha ng declaration of nullity or annulment, mas madali itong divorce. So what we need to do is to offer a solution, not to go into the immorality of abortion, or rather of divorce, or the church position. That's old. That's old argument. No, you can argue that until you're blue. Hindi tatalab yun because there's a problem. So you have to address that problem, no, and not argue in a different reason, no. Separation of church and state, no.